It's a thumb drive for a computer. This one has 256 gigabytes. It is a lot. Janine ordered thumb drives this past week, and how many of you know how to plug a USB port into the back of your smart television? If you're going to connect a DVD device or something with an HDMI, and I may be speaking a foreign language to many people, but the newer television, you'd be surprised at how far back you can go in many of these televisions that have HDMI, they have USB ports, they have the old 3 cords that are red, yellow, and white, or whatever color they are, those that connect. But they do have a USB port. And if they have an HDMI, check and see. They probably have a USB port. Rabbit ears. Well, yeah, and there you go. I've been antiquated by that story. I don't know, rabbit ears and dog ears, but I wanted to tell you this because for this next year, all of the audio Bible books are going to be on a thumb drive that you can plug into the, as I look on this television, this television does not appear to have a USB. This is an older one, but that one, if you can get behind it, you plug this in. You can plug it into your computer, right here, thumb drive, or your USB port in your car. Plug it in, they're audio files, and as I told you before, I'm not responsible for any car accidents. Tune it in before you leave the driveway or leave wherever you're going. Find the book you want to listen to. You can listen to the entire book in its continuity. You don't have to go chapter by chapter. You'll be able to do this. And if you plug it in, many of the modern cars will have a screen, and it will come up, and it will tell you that you have an auxiliary plug-in on there, and it'll tell you. It'll come up just like your radio. It'll let you search it. Same with the TV. Yep. Just like if you plug your DVD player into it, it'll pick up, it'll sense that it has there, and it'll come up on your screen. You just have to scroll through it with your channel changer. How much do you have? Buy the truth and sell it not. These are free. You'd be surprised at how inexpensive these USB drives. I got the idea from Greg Nienhaus. Greg, how many did we buy to take over to Ghana? 50? 100? They're very inexpensive, and they'll have the ones we're getting 32 gigabytes. Is that what it was? At the very least, it's 16 gigabytes, but plenty of, so that you can, already preloaded. It'll already be on there. You don't have to worry about it. You do not have to be on the internet, and that's the advantage of these. You do not have to be on the internet. You can, if you have a computer, put the USB drive in there. It'll show you what it has. If you have a TV, put it in the back. You do not have to have an internet connection for the thumb drives.
It's just an extra hard drive, really.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. You don't have to download them. I have a pie chart, and I have Venn diagrams that will explain all of this in great detail. Yes, and you call me anytime. Anytime. How many, I know this is sort of dragging on, but how many of you have copies of the New Testament on cassette tapes? The box was like this big. Well, maybe. And then you had the DVDs. You had all the packets, and you had to change them. Everything will be on here. Plug it in, leave it in your car, leave it in your house, It'll be on there. You don't have to download anything. It'll be right there for you, and the other lessons. So, okay, any questions about that? I'll explain it. They say that you have to tell people something 7 times before it sinks in. Or is that they have to tell me 7 times? Janine has to tell me something 7 times. That's the way it was. All right, we are in the Matthew chapter, where are we at? Oh, Matthew chapter 9. Matthew chapter 9. And again, Mark, thank you for putting those statistics on the front page. It helps people to understand that we're doing things that have a global impact. Trending, yes. I'm trending all right. Matthew chapter 9, verse 14. Jesus has not gotten to the point chronologically to where he has even given the sermon about the parable of the sower. But he's going to give them a parable because the disciples of John, starting in verse 14 of Matthew chapter 9, then the disciples of John came to him saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, and how many examples do you think he's going to give them within the context of this parable? You're close. 3. He's going to give them 3 examples to support why he does not fast according to either John's disciples, and when he says John's disciples, who is he talking about? Who's John? John the Baptist. John the Baptizer. John the Baptizer. Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, number 1, can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. Second example, no one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. The third, neither is new wineskin put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, so both are preserved. 3 examples that he gives to them. Now, some people,
The last 2 are similar.
yes, they're the same thing, only different. Some people, when they interpret Scripture, will go to the extreme. And you know what they get out of this parable? Jesus promotes drinking.
Yeah.
It's just, to them, that's what they see. Jesus is promoting drinking. That's all they see. He who has ears, let him hear.
Because of the wineskin?
Yes, the wineskins. And some people say, he's not really talking about wine, he's talking about grape juice. And I buy that. But we're smarter than that because we're not going to jump to those conclusions. So he's talking about fasting. Tell me a little bit about fasting.
Going without food.
Going without food. I have been, and don't feel sorry for me, I have been without food now for almost 3 hours. It is pretty impressive, isn't it? I have that number of how many hours right next to my humility award.
Nighttime is a fast. That's why we call the first meal break fast.
Yeah, we break the fast. But they're not talking about going from night to morning without eating, and they're not talking about 3 hours without eating. They're talking about the traditions of fasting that they had put on. I appreciate that. Go ahead and show me how much I'm eating. I really am okay. I'm not in danger of flopping over.
How many days is fast?
Fasting could just be a single day, but in the case, it's interesting why they notice this. How would they have noticed that they don't fast? Perhaps it was that they were there on the heels of a of a great feast that they were having, in which everyone was fasting, in which people would not normally go to the market to buy food. And there's Jesus' disciples. They're buying food and they're eating while everybody else is fasting. Yes. Yeah, and some of you say, mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. The second half of that parable that Jesus told about the Pharisee who was standing in the temple praying and the tax collector who was also praying, and the attitudes of them both. He said, I fast twice a week. I do this and I do that. So fasting was a badge that someone would wear, which was never what it was meant in the old law. There were times when it would talk about you would humble yourselves. And so that was a way of saying that they would go without food. But they noticed that Jesus' disciples aren't fasting. And Jesus tells these three things. Can the wedding guests... Now, let's back up just a little bit. Why did he use these three examples? They were things that the people would have understood. The tradition of the wedding, the tradition of what they would see. Perhaps there were people that did sewing, and the idea that they would put new wine into new wineskins. Things that their culture would have easily have understood. Yes, things that they would have understood, and he reinforces why. Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? Well, you could, but that wouldn't be normal. For as long as the wedding groom is there with you, what typically do you do with the wedding groom? Feast, you celebrate. This is not till after the wedding groom has left. Then the party's over, turn out the lights. They would have understood this. It was part of what they would do every day, or at least they would see on a regular basis. He says, but the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast.
Now that sounds like he's talking about himself.
He's talking about himself, and they would not have understood that yet. But they would understand in a sense. But if he only used that one, they might have scratched their head and said, I don't really get it. But then he tells the second one. Now, how many of you, when you buy really nice shirts, I'm not going to untuck my shirt, but if I were to, on one of the parts of, what is this called here? The lapel? Yeah. Right below the waistline, there are 3 extra buttons that are sewn on there. Yeah. And I wonder, well, what am I going to hook to that? How many of you know what those 3 buttons are for? Kathy, tell us. If you lose a button, you would understand that. Mike? I should be using those, shouldn't I? Yes. Did everybody hear? He said those are the overeating buttons. Who else had their hand up? Tim.
They're also 3 different sizes.
3 different sizes. And if you have buttons on your lapel, or you have, how down here, what's the third size? Oh, the cuff. Yes, of course. Yes. I missed that in my home economics class. Missed it. But the ladies would have understood that, wouldn't they? But he's not talking about buttons, he's talking about the patch. How many of you, when you buy the shirt, find this patch about that big that comes with the shirt? They may not do it much anymore, but they used to. There used to be a little patch, and people said, oh, that's to repair a hole. But it wasn't. You wash that patch to see if it loses its color, what you can wash it with. Am I right on that? Yeah. And so you would know that. See how much you're going to learn here? No extra charge for this. No extra charge. So they would have understood, no one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. And they would say, oh, I get it. Yeah. I'm not going to use, if I have an old garment and then I put a new patch on there, as soon as I wash it and it shrinks, it's going to pull and it's going to make that hole even worse. Now they're really wondering, I don't know what he's talking about. I understand the concept, but what is he talking about? Now he comes to the third one. When he says, neither is new wine put into old wineskins. Oh, of course it isn't put into old wineskins. How many of you know about the fermenting process of grape juice?
Well, anything when it ferments, it gives off gas.
Yes, and it's going to stretch. We use bottles today. And so they aren't subject to that same, and the corks are put in big enough. Not that I know anything about that, but we understand the concept. But back in the day is a Greek term which means a long time ago, way long time ago. But they would have animal skins, or they might use animal intestines for that case of carrying water.
Stomachs.
Or stomachs, yes. But in the case of wineskins, it would be such as leather. And I remember I used to see people that would carry these. They looked like the old mountain man. But if you carried water, there was no danger of that. But if you had something that was going through the fermentation process, that new leather would stretch out and swell. And once that leather stretched out and swelled,
As far as it can go.
swollened, yeah, as far as it go, it didn't have the elasticity to come back.
Right.
So one-time use. So the next time you went to put new wine into an old wineskin and it wouldn't stretch, what would happen? It bursted. It really bursted it. Okay? So we have these three that he has told, and what is it when you use three examples? It's called a triplet. He uses these three examples to teach them.
A triune.
A triune. You were trying, very, very trying, yes. Luke chapter 5 adds just a little bit more to it. Luke chapter 5, verse 30, let's see. We'll start in verse 33. Luke chapter 5, verse 33, beginning. And they said to him, the disciples of John fast often and offer prayers, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees. But yours eat and drink. And Jesus said to them, can you make wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? Okay, you wouldn't fast during the wedding feast, would you? This makes it just a little bit clearer. But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. He has told them a parable. He also told them a parable. No one tears a piece from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. If he does, he will tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. Here's an interesting part that is added only in Luke's gospel. And no one, after drinking old wine, desires new, for he says the old is good. And that's where people said, see, he's promoting drinking. But he's not. What does he mean? And no one, after drinking old wine, desires new, for he says the old is good. Aging wine and fermented products tend to get better with age. It's that true with the aging of when they process beer, it's called a brewery. When they process hard alcohol, it's called a distillery. When they process wine, it's called a winery. Okay? All of those tend to get better with age. So they tell me. And he says that no one, after drinking old wine, desires new, for he says the old is good.
I just read about a very old wine that is whiskey, it was rather. Sorry, but it was $75,000 for the container. So if anybody,
Yeah, I would say you probably wouldn't order that on Amazon and have it delivered, would you? Yeah. Yes. And so the aging process, And so he's quite correct when he says, and no one after drinking old wine desires new, for he says the old is good. If we go back to chapter 4, as Jesus is going to the wedding feast, and after a while they run out of wine. And his mother says, they've run out of wine. And Jesus' response is, what does that have to do with me? My time has not yet come. The first miracle that he does is he turns water into wine. And when they taste it, what is it? Well, we're about to find out. What wine does he make? The good wine. And the man responds by saying, usually when we go to a wedding, they serve the good stuff first. That way, when they've got a little tipsy, see, they're not drinking grape juice like some people say. We're smart enough to know that. It says, and after they've drunk, then they serve the cheap stuff. But he says, you haven't done that, as the man who is a steward. So we can gather a little bit about what the culture is there. But he says, and no one after drinking old wine desires new. But Jesus said that he's the new wine. What does he mean when he says people, when they've had the old, don't desire the new? They want the old. He who has ears, let him hear.
They don't want to change tradition.
Say that loud enough that everybody can hear it again.
They don't want to go away from their old tradition and go to the new gospel.
There they go. They don't want to give up the old. Now, that would never happen to us. If you can think of someone who, we're well worn in our traditions, and it doesn't matter what tradition it is, and someone comes up with something new, and they say, you need to try this. How likely are you to pursue something that's new? New and improved. No, thank you. I'll take the old and yeah, that.
I often think of the Jews' position in this situation where Jesus comes out of Nazareth, unknown, not a popular, well, he's popular among his followers, but he's not popular amongst the others. And he comes up with this teaching, and these Jews who are doing something entirely different, practicing religion entirely different. How hard it would be to believe in Jesus. You've been taught something entirely different. You're expecting a king to come like David, alive and on a white horse, so to speak, and rescue your nation. And Jesus comes in entirely different, everything opposite of what they're thinking. And how are they supposed to believe? Well, it's harder for them to believe than it is for the Gentiles. Some believe, but only a few. But imagine how hard that would be.
Did everybody hear what he said? Go ahead and repeat that again. Now, you're right on, because he's talking about the Jews who are well entrenched in all of their traditions. And even though those traditions are, as Jesus said, they are the doctrines and commandments of men, but they're upholding them. And Jesus in these three says, in essence, because we have the advantage of having the entire, not only the Gospels, but the teachings following that, to grasp what he's talking about, is the fact that Jesus is saying, I can't fit this new gospel on your old traditions and law. And I'm not here to refurbish them. They can't be. Because Paul said what to the church at Galatia about what the purpose of the old law was?
Bring us to Jesus.
It's to bring us to Jesus. It was the schoolmaster. Technically, it was the one who took care of that child, and the child leaves the house, and his responsibility is to get the child from that house to that schoolhouse. He's not the schoolmaster. He's not the teacher. He's not Mr. Chips. He's the guy whose responsibility it was to get that child there. And that's the purpose of the old law. I can't put that old patch, new patch, on an old garment. I can't put my new wine into your old wineskins. And they're not going to mourn with me. They're going to celebrate with me while I'm still here. But the time's going to come when they will mourn. And they did.
But the law was so, the person who believed the law and then believed in Jesus really had to know the old law from the heart standpoint. Instead of the letter of the law, he had to think about, what does this really mean? And it meant that somebody is going to come and rescue us from our own sins. But those who were just following it from a general, with a general attitude that I'm a Jew, I'm going to follow the old law, they didn't understand the depth of it. So they didn't follow Jesus.
Yes, and Paul explains that when he writes to the Romans. He says, what's the advantage of being a Jew? He says, much in every way. They were entrusted with the Scriptures.
Yeah.
And salvation came first to the Jews, then the Gentiles. Had to come to them first. He said, they have a great advantage. They knew the Scriptures. They knew, if they could understand that what Paul taught them, it's the schoolmaster. It was meant to bring you to the Messiah. Some people say the Messiah. Some people just say to bring you Messiah. To Messiah.
I studied with a Jew and his family, and this is what he believed, that law brought him to Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. So he says there's a difference. I'm not here to improve the law. I'm not here for the new improved law. But remember what he said in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, not one jot or tittle will pass away until what? Till all is fulfilled. And when Jesus hung upon the cross, the last thing that he said is, it is finished. Everything that they wrote about me in the old law is now completed, except for one thing, the resurrection. And that's what the purpose was. Everything that they wrote about me, it's been fulfilled. And when he is resurrected, he will tell those two on the road to Emmaus, and then later that same day to his disciples, he says, and then beginning with Moses and all the prophets in one spot. And then he says, with the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. All of those were written about me, and he had to explain it to them. And that was, you wrote something on the front of your bulletin today, and you called it what kind of moment? It was an aha moment. It was like, really? They had just spent upwards of 3.5 years with Jesus. And then he has to open up their minds, and it was like, really? Do you ever have one of those moments? Really? I guess I understand it now. And for some, like me, it takes a long time to grasp those things. You, not so long, I know.
Well, look at the disciples, those who were chosen as apostles. Look how long it took them to actually, they really didn't catch on until he was gone.
Mm-hmm.
Savior's gone. Oh, now I know. But before that, it's just too much to grasp.
And then even after that, Peter comes to Acts chapter 10, and he's told, I want you to go to see this place. People are going to come for you. I want you to go. Peter realizes that they're Gentiles. Even then, Peter didn't realize it when Jesus said, go into part of the world. Go to all the Jews. No, go into all the world. So it is my biology teacher, and Mr. Seibert, if you are watching this, thank you so much for telling me this. Notice I called him Mr. Education is a slow process. And so as he as he teaches this in Matthew chapter 9, I believe that last sentence in Luke chapter 6, and no one after drinking old wine desires new, for he says the old is good. And it applies not only to the Pharisees and those in that time, but it applies to us as well. I get very, very comfortable with many things in my life. And that's why it's so hard to start something new in the middle of the year.
Yeah.
And why it's so easy to start when? January 1st, that's exactly right. That's why it's so easy. Because we say, well, as soon as I flip that, as long as I'm in December, but boy, when I flip that page, it's like I was born again. I can do anything. Not on December 31st, but on January 1st.
You got a clean slate.
Yes, we are creatures of habit, and Jesus knew that. He says, and no one after drinking old wine desires the new. Who is he talking about? He's talking about the Pharisees. Might have been talking even in a sense about John's disciples. Because you've got your old wine. You're not going to desire this new because the old is what you're used to, you're comfortable, you know it, and you're not going to step out of what kind of zone? Your comfort zone. And the comfort zone is one of the hardest things to step out of, to learn and practice and do something new. And he knew that. And he gives this parable here in Matthew chapter 9, Luke chapter 5, and Mark chapter 5. In this. And you obviously can put yourself in that crowd, and you hear this, and imagine what you're thinking when you hear this parable taught. What would you have thought? Could you have made the connection? The first time as a Christian, when I read this, I had no idea what he was talking about. No idea. I had to be taught. I had to be taught. I had to research it. I had to study it in order to know.
Yeah.
Because he said, he who has ears, let him hear. And so for us today, the fact that we might read this the first time and not understand it, does that mean that our heart is hard? Does it mean that we cannot learn?
We need to read it again.
No, we need to learn. Peter talks about the fact that he wants our knowledge to increase. And what's one of the things that Peter says that he wants to be ever increasing in us? Knowledge. And how do we get that knowledge? We put the Bible under our pillow at night, and we sleep on it, and it somehow soaks into our brain. Does anybody believe that? I figured you would. No, we have to read and study. And are we surprised when we don't grow, when we stop reading the Word of God? Should we be surprised? Sometimes we may get into the habit of, like the old wine. I think I've read it enough. I know enough. I'm good. I'm good with this.
We often understand it with our relationships with one another. If I don't talk to you or express how I feel, I can't expect that relationship to grow. It's no different with the Word of God. That relationship can grow if you spend time with the Word.
Mm-hmm. I didn't mean to interrupt you. That's the first bell. So I have a hard time counting on those bells, so I'm going to keep that finger open there. Is this a tough? Yes, go ahead, Donato.
Just a thought. I know it's time constrained. I understand completely what Wes said about the Jews and Christ. But I think to myself, and how is it that I, myself, who know Christ, who accepted Christ, who love Christ, on any given minute of any given day can be heading down the road to destruction? And I know the answer. I know who the Savior is. So it helps me to focus on my life with Christ. Understanding that, as you said, you who have ears to hear, let them listen. They were not ready
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Did everybody hear him? On any given day, your ability to continue on in Christ safe to say, could go one way or another, lest you stay in the Word, stay in Christ. There might be few people in here who were as white-knuckled and as insolent and hard-hearted as I am. I was. I think I am still sometimes, especially when it comes to the Tigers. But I was very unwilling to accept anything about religion for the longest time. And it may have been the car accident that happened just before that woke me up. And not too many days before that, I had an accident in skydiving, which is why I don't go skydiving anymore. And I almost fell to my death. Not many days after that was the car accident. I thought, maybe somebody's trying to get my attention. Can I say for sure? Nope. But it did get my attention and caused me to think on the shortness and brevity of life. Might not work for everybody, but it worked for this guy.
How old were you?
22. 22. But at that point, nothing to do with religion. And I had been attending church with Janine before those accidents. And when they stood up, I didn't stood up.
And I didn't mess with the parachute or the brakes.
Yep. Why was that hacksaw there? Anyways. But, when they closed their eyes and bowed their head, not me. My chin was up here and my eyes were open. I'm not closing my eyes. I'm not praying with you people. And the fact that, I was unwilling. And so when I run into people today that are not searchers, I think that's okay. I'm not going to cast a stone at them because I know myself from the mire that I came out of. So I'm going to be very, very patient because God was very, very patient, very merciful with me.
Makes you think everything is possible.
Yes. And if it happened with me, it can happen with anybody.
John Clayton, who was a high school science teacher, was an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
And he was trying to study to disprove Christianity, ended up being converted.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. And many people do that are so staunch. And so the passage in Luke chapter 5, when he says, yep, no one after drinking old wine desires new. But that can change. That can change if we're willing just to let that door come open just a little bit. I think that last one was 2 bells, so there's been 3. So
I think we need
we'll count it as 2.
prayers for open our hearts.
Yeah, I think we do. Well, let's have